The opening chapter in our 10-part chronicle of Max Payne, 2001, begins in the psychological ground zero of a suburban New Jersey home. This is the narrative shattering of the mirror, where the physical architecture of a middle-class dream is violated by the chemical influence of Valkyr V. Within the blood-stained nursery and the echoing hallway, the protagonist witnesses the senseless erasure of his wife, Michelle, and his infant daughter. The lore of this era is the lore of the irreversible catalyst. Its purpose was the destruction of the moral anchor. The history of the August 1998 incident is the history of the Valkyr leak, where a secret military project escaped its containment to infect the domestic sphere. This is the tragedy of the sleeping detective, proving that home is not a stronghold, but a fragile shell that cracks when the abyss wants inside. The lore of the Valkyr V ingestion provides the chemical foundation for this chapter's ruin. Developed by Acer Corporation, Valkyr was a combat stimulant designed to overload the synapses with Norse hallucinations and violent psychosis. The lore suggests that the drug was a weaponized mythology. Its purpose was the creation of the berserker soldier. When the addicts breached Max's front door, they weren't robbing him. They were executing a scientific trial in the wild. This reveals the predatory purpose of the Valkyr origin. The corporate elite tested the viability of their product on the families of the law. This was the era of the green vial. This shows that the history of Max Payne is a history of the injection, which turns the citizen into a demon. The physical environment of the Payne residence provides insight into the atmospheric despair of the fall. This is a shrine to the American dream, subverted by graffiti and gore, symbolizing the end of the 20th century optimism. The lore of the defiled sanctuary explains that its purpose was the permanent severing of the hero from humanity. By losing everything in the first 10 minutes, Max is stripped of his social contract, allowing him to operate outside the bounds of the law for the rest of the narrative. This reveals the nihilistic purpose of the massacre. It created a grief so absolute that it became an engine for vengeance. This was the era of the red crayon. This shows that the history of the house is a history of the grave, which Max carries with him into the snowy streets of New York. The relationship between the Valkyr addicts and the Acer experiment represents the biological disposable within the fall. These junkies were low-level test subjects who believed they were seeing Valkyries and Ragnarok. The lore suggests that the addict is a tool. Its purpose was the real-world stress test of the Valkyr formula. By directing these madmen toward a police officer's home, Nicole Horn, CEO of Acer, ensured the maximum emotional impact to see if the drug could overcome the survival instinct. This reveals the cold-blooded purpose of the initial conflict. Max's family were just variables in a corporate ledger. This was the era of the laboratory city. The history of the addicts is the history of the symptom, which hides the disease of the elite. The act concludes with the silent observation of Max Payne as he stands over the cradle, realizing that his life has ended, but his body is still moving. The purpose of the Roscoe Street Massacre lore was to be the universal exposure of the fragility of peace. It shows that evil does not wait for a reason. Max realizes that he is now a man of the shadows. The rise of the Punisher is the first movement of the Max Payne lore, proving that in the world of the noir, innocence is not a state of being, it is a target that is sighted by the avarice of the powerful. The second chapter in our 10-part chronicle of Max Payne 1 records the legal evaporation of a man transformed into a vengeful ghost. This is the narrative submergence, where the physical architecture of Max's existence, the NYPD precinct and the warmth of the precinct coffee, is replaced by the grime of the underworld. After the burial of his bloodline, Max leaves the NYPD to join the DEA, choosing the suicidal path of deep cover. The lore of this era is the lore of the erased identity. Its purpose was the infiltration of the chemical supply chain. For 3 hollow years, Max navigated the labyrinths of the Punchinello crime family, trading his integrity for information on the Valkyr plague. This is the tragedy of the undercover operative, proving that the badge is a target that draws the fire of both sides of the law. The lore of the DEA, Drug Enforcement Administration mandate, provides the institutional foundation for this chapter's isolation. To the general public and the police force, Max Payne was a burned-out cop who vanished. The lore suggests that the cover was a surgical procedure. Its purpose was the tactical localization of the Valkyr manufacturing labs. By losing himself in the criminal persona, Max became a vital organ inside the mafia's body, pumping intelligence back to his only friend, Alex Balder. This reveals the calculative purpose of the DEA bureaucracy. They used Max's grief as a fuel to ignite a war they were too slow to fight with warrants. This was the era of the secret ledger. This shows that the history of the DEA is a history of the cold calculation, which values the result over the life of the asset. The physical environment of the Roscoe Street subway station provides insight into the atmospheric ambush of the fall. This is a liminal space of iron girders and flickering fluorescence, symbolizing the transition between the life of law and the life of the outlaw. The lore of the trapped corridor explains that its purpose was the execution of the tactical betrayal. As Max arrived to meet Alex, he found the station overrun by Punchinello's thugs, leading to the assassination of his only lifeline. This reveals the strategic purpose of the ambush. By killing the only man who knew Max was a cop, the conspiracy stripped him of his humanity and labeled him a cop killer. This was the era of the echoing gunshot. This shows that the history of Roscoe Street is a history of the void, where the protector is converted into the prey. The relationship between Alex Balder and the murder charge represents the legal death within the fall. Alex was not just a handler, he was the witness to Max's sanity. The lore suggests that the friend is a vulnerability. Its purpose was the universal framing of the protagonist. With Alex dead on the platform, the NYPD issued an all-points bulletin for Max Payne, charging him with the murder of his own partner. This reveals the nihilistic purpose of the conspiracy's design. They didn't just want Max dead, they wanted him hated by the people he swore to defend. This was the era of the wanted poster. The history of the framing is the history of the isolation, which leaves the hero with nowhere to hide but the abyss. The lore of the Punchinello bank heist and the chemical diversion represents the criminal mask of the fall. During the Roscoe Street incident, the mob was attempting to rob the subway vaults, but the lore reveals it was a ruse to draw the police into a firefight. The lore suggests that the crime is a distraction. Its purpose was the purification of the Valkyr evidence. While the police hunted Max through the tunnels, the Acer Corporation was erasing the paper trail that linked the subway labs to the corporate penthouse. This reveals the orchestrated purpose of the urban unrest. The mafia was the hammer, but the corporation was the architect. This was the era of the false flag. This shows that the history of the heist is a history of the smokescreen, which blinds the justice to the true criminal. The relationship between BB, the traitor, and the DEA compromise represents the institutional rot within the fall. BB, another DEA agent, was secretly on the Acer payroll, providing the kill teams with Max's location. The lore suggests that the colleague is the executioner. Its purpose was the internal liquidation of the investigation. By selling Max out, BB ensured that the DEA would disavow the operation, leaving Max stranded in a world that viewed him as a monster. This reveals the greedy purpose of the betrayal. In the world of Max Payne, loyalty is a commodity that is traded for a higher standard of living. This was the era of the radio silence. The history of BB is the history of the infection, which turns the law into a weapon for the guilty. Furthermore, the lore of the Blizzard of 2001 and the visual oppression represents the environmental cage within the fall. As Max escaped the subway, the worst storm in history began to bury New York. The lore suggests that nature is a witness. Its purpose was the immobilization of the social order. With the snow choking the streets, the police couldn't follow Max into the darkest corners of the underworld, allowing him to conduct his one-man war without interference. This reveals the atmospheric purpose of the Noir vision. The cold acts as a shroud that covers the blood and muffles the screams. This was the era of the white silence. This shows that the history of the blizzard is a history of the purgatory, which freezes the time and leaves the slayer alone with his grief. The act concludes with the final realization of Max Payne as he steps onto the frozen street, realizing that he is now legally dead and morally homeless. The purpose of the undercover descent lore was to be the universal exposure of the individual's fragility against the institution. It shows that the truth is powerless without a platform. Max realizes that he no longer exists in the files of the city. The rise of the fugitive vengeance is the second movement of the Max Payne lore, proving that in the world of the noir, identity is not a fact, it is a permission that is revoked by the powerful the moment you become a threat. The legacy of Alex Balder in this chapter is the horror of the erased identity. We realize that safety was a paper shield and truth was a target that BB pierced with a high-caliber lie. The purpose of the workshop of the underground was to exile the soul, and the fall was the death of the lawman. As Max reloads his Beretta in the shadow of a subway in trance and stares at the blood on his hands, hearing the sirens wailing for him, they understand that the history of the DA is the history of the shadow, a shadow that gathers strength the deeper you sink into the cold night of New York. The third chapter in our 10-part chronicle of Max Payne 1 descends into the gothic insanity of the Punchinello crime family's internal collapse. This is the narrative descent into the maw, where the physical architecture of the criminal underworld, grubby tenement blocks, industrial hotels, and the sacrilegious neon of the Ragnarok nightclub becomes a cathedral of the damned. Within the blood-smeared altars and drug-induced hysteria, Max witnesses the theological mutation of the Italian-American mob. The lore of this era is the lore of the chemical zealot. Its purpose was the transition from organized crime to chaotic cultism. The history of the Mafia Civil War is the history of the Jack Lupino schism, where a mafia underboss drowned in Valkyr and traded his business sense for satanic visions. This is the tragedy of the neighborhood kingpin, proving that Valkyr does not just kill the body, it rewrites the soul into a script for Ragnarok. The lore of the Lupino psychosis provides the neurological foundation for this chapter's horror. Jack Lupino, the heavy of the Punchinello family, became the primary test subject for the high-potency strains of Valkyr. The lore suggests that the drug was a spirit crusher. Its purpose was the tactical removal of the user's empathy. Under the influence, Lupino believed he was a vessel for Fenris, the great wolf, sacrificing his own soldiers to appease the demons of the night. This reveals the metaphysical purpose of the Valkyr spread. It turned a criminal syndicate into a death cult to maximize the urban chaos. This was the era of the pentagram. This shows that the history of Lupino is a history of the hallucination, which blurs the line between the gutter and hell. The physical environment of the Ragnarok nightclub provides insight into the aesthetic of the apocalypse of the fall. This is a fortress of steel draped in Norse mythology and industrial noise, symbolizing the corporate intent to replace religion with addiction. The lore of the Temple of Neon explains that its purpose was the ritualistic grooming of the Valkyr army. As Max breaches the inner sanctum, he finds altars dedicated to death, showing that Lupino had exited the mafia and entered a war of the mind. This reveals the iconoclastic purpose of the infiltration. Max was not just cleaning the streets, he was exorcising the city's nightmare. This was the era of the screaming guitar. This shows that the history of Ragnarok is a history of the profane, where the music muffles the screams of the lost. The relationship between Vinnie Gognitti and the internal power struggle represents the cowardly pragmatism within the fall. Gognitti, the nervous accountant for Lupino, represented the dying breed of traditional greed terrified by the new supernatural violence. The lore suggests that the mob was fragmenting. Its purpose was the desperate containment of the Lupino scandal. By attempting to assassinate Gognitti, Max forced the mafia to turn on its own, creating a distraction that allowed him to reach the dawn. This reveals the parasitic purpose of the underworld internalization. The criminals started eating themselves because they couldn't control the weapon they sold. This was the era of the back alley pursuit. The history of Gognitti is the history of the rat, which squeals for the hero to save the villain. Furthermore, the lore of the Valkyr manifestos and the poetic insanity represents the literary decay within the fall. Throughout the Ragnarok offices, Max discovers books on witchcraft and Norse runes, annotated by Lupino. The lore suggests that knowledge is a poison. Its purpose was the rationalization of the murderous impulse. Lupino integrated the names of the Aesir gods into his criminal strategy, viewing himself as the architect of the end. This reveals the psychological purpose of the Valkyr dependency. It gives the killer a purpose higher than money. This was the era of the written curse. This shows that the history of the manifestos is a history of the delusion, which turns the hitman into a prophet. The relationship between the trio of killers and the specialized brutality represents the escalation of the enforcers within the fall. Lupino's personal bodyguards, Frankie the Bat Niagara, Joe Deadpan Salem, and Vince Muggsy Mugnione, represented the peak of mafia lethality. The lore suggests that the trio was a test. Its purpose was the physical deterrence of the DEA investigation. By defeating these specialized killers in a gauntlet of iron, Max proved that his grief-fueled determination outmatched their paycheck-fueled cruelty. This reveals the lethal purpose of the mafia's resistance. They underestimated the momentum of a dead man. This was the era of the baseball bat. The history of the trio is the history of the obstacle, which fails to stop the slayer. The lore of the hotel and the waterfront hideouts represents the urban infection within the fall. Max's path to Lupino required the clearance of slums and abandoned warehouses, showing how the Punchinello family had hollowed out the infrastructure of Brooklyn. The lore suggests that the city is a corpse. Its purpose was the provision of a lawless shadow zone. These hotels were not lodgings, but Valkyr dens where the attics were stored like inventory. This reveals the industrial purpose of the mafia's territory. The buildings were vessels for the plague. This was the era of the stained mattress. This shows that the history of the waterfront is a history of the rot, which claims the piers and buries the honesty. The act concludes with the violent confrontation atop the Ragnarok stage, as Max executes Jack Lupino in a rain of brass and blood. The purpose of the Mafia Civil War lore was to be the universal exposure of the end of the old guard. It shows that respect is dead. Max realizes that Lupino was just a madman, and the real Don is still in the manor. The rise of the Mona-Sax alliance is the final movement of the Lupino lore, proving that in the world of Max Payne, family is not a bond, it is a target that is cited by the ambition of the addicted. The legacy of Jack Lupino in this chapter is the horror of the chemical zealot. We realize that loyalty was a drug-induced fervor and command was a scream that Nicole Horn used to direct the violence of the damned. The purpose of the workshop of the mob was to automate the slaughter, and the fall was the corruption of the spirit. As Max reloads his shotgun on the shattered altar and looks at the body of the fallen Viking, hearing the wailing of the sirens muffled by the winter, they understand that the history of the mafia is the history of the ash, an ash that coats the stage and reminds the slayer that the true demon is still hidden in the light. The fourth chapter in our 10-part chronicle of Max Payne 1 marks the violent foreclosure of the Punchinello crime family. This is the narrative end of the neighborhood, where the physical architecture of old-world power, the gilded walls and velvet curtains of the Punchinello manor, is demolished by the modern efficiency of the corporate state. Within the blood-spattered dining rooms and cold storage lockers, Max witnesses the institutional decay of the Italian-American mob. The lore of this era is the lore of the obsolete syndicate. Its purpose was the transition of power from the street to the suit. The history of the manor siege is the history of the decapitation of the patriarch, where Angelo Punchinello realized too late that he was no longer a kingpin, but a middleman who had outlived his usefulness to the Acer Corporation. This is the tragedy of the neighborhood butcher, proving that tradition is no armor against the calculated cold of a corporate takeover. The lore of the Punchinello-Acer partnership provides the logistical foundation for this chapter's betrayal. For years, the mob provided the distribution muscle for the Valkyr plague, infecting the urban core, while Nicole Horn laundered the proceeds. The lore suggests that the mafia was a screen. Its purpose was the insulation of the corporate entity from the street-level felony. However, as the slayer, Max, dismantled the chain of command, the Acer executives decided to liquidate their partners to erase the paper trail. This reveals the predatory purpose of the corporate strategy. They used the old guard to seed the market and then killed them to claim the harvest. The rise of the manor assault was the end of the criminal code, proving that loyalty is a bad investment in the eyes of the board of directors. The physical environment of the Punchinello manor provides insight into the Baroque despair of the fall. This is a fortress of ego stuffed with stolen art and ornate trophies, representing the delusion of permanence. The lore of the besieged sanctuary explains that its purpose was the illusion of safety. As Max breaches the high stone walls, he finds the mafia soldiers caught in a crossfire between Max's vengeance and the Acer hit squads. This reveals the pathetic purpose of the Don's final stand. Angelo Punchinello died begging for help from the woman who was already paying for his funeral. This was the era of the crumbling estate. This shows that the history of the manor is a history of the hubris, where the king is slaughtered in his own throne room. The relationship between Mona Sachs and the parallel mission represents the moral ambiguity within the fall. Mona, the assassin and sister-in-law to the Don, represented the precision that Max lacked. The lore suggests that the partner is a paradox. Its purpose was the execution of the internal justice. By providing Max with a drink that was laced with Valkyr to save him from the hit squads, Mona directed the chaos to ensure the Don's death served her own goals. This reveals the strategic purpose of the femme fatale. She used Max as a blunt instrument to shatter the organization from the inside. This was the era of the poisoned toast. The history of Mona is the history of the conflict, which pulls the trigger on the old world. Furthermore, the lore of the trio of killers and the final enforcers represents the divergent brutality within the fall. To protect his life, the Don deployed his most trusted killers, Pilny, Nieti, and the rest of the inner circle muscle. The lore suggests that muscle is obsolete. Its purpose was the final enforcement of the patriarch's will. Their failure signaled the absolute end of the mob's lethality against the Valkyr-infused determination of Max. This reveals the obsolescent purpose of the trio. They were relics of a street war fighting in a corporate world. This was the era of the bullet time climax. The history of the trio is the history of the dead end, where the strength is crushed by the momentum of the narrative. The relationship between the black suit assassins and the Acer betrayal represents the surgical execution of the fall. When Max reaches the Don's inner sanctum, he finds the black suits, Acer's private army, already executing the mafia staff. The lore suggests that the Don was a loose end. Its purpose was the purification of the conspiracy's image. By erasing the criminal elements, Nicole Horn sought to rebrand herself as a victim of the urban unrest she created. This reveals the calculative purpose of the corporate assassins. They don't kill for respect, they kill for confidentiality. This was the era of the silent replacement. The history of the black suits is the history of the eraser, which removes the signature of the guilty. The lore of the shipping docks and the Russian influence represents the global shift of the fall. As the Punchinello family faltered, Vladimir Lem and the Russian mob began to encroach on the docks, providing Max with heavy weaponry to target the Italians. The lore suggests that the enemy of my enemy is a temporary asset. Its purpose was the destabilization of the existing monopoly. This reveals the opportunistic purpose of the Russian intervention. They used Max as a janitor to sweep the Italians into the river so they could move into the warehouse. This was the era of the industrial bloodbath. This shows that the history of the docks is a history of the transition, where the old world is replaced by the Eastern cold. The act concludes with the silent observation of Max Payne as he watches the Don bleed out on the carpet, realizing that the ghost he chased was just a puppet. The purpose of the fall of the mob was to be the universal exposure of the obsolete honor. It shows that blood oaths mean nothing to a server farm. Max realizes that the true enemy is not in a social club, but in a boardroom. The rise of the anti-Assur crusade is the final movement of the mafia lore, proving that in the world of Max Payne, family is not a bond, it is a target that is painted by the greed of the machine. The legacy of the Punchinello Manor in this chapter is the horror of the obsolete syndicate. We realize that power was an illusion and control was a loan that Nicole Horn called in with interest. The purpose of the workshop of the mob was to manage the filth, and the fall was the foreclosure of the underworld. As Max steps over the body of the Don and heads toward the elevator, hearing the helicopter of the Assur strike team circling the roof, they understand that the history of the manor is the history of the end, an end that leaves the street empty and the suit victorious. The fifth chapter in our 10-part chronicle of Max Payne 1 peels back the civilian veil to reveal the Cold War skeleton of the Valkyr project. This is the narrative excavation of the sin, where the physical architecture of the city gives way to the subterranean brutality of Project Valhalla, an underground research facility buried beneath the snow. Within the rusted lab equipment and classified filing cabinets, Max witnesses the scientific depravity that birthed his nightmare. The lore of this era is the lore of the weaponized trauma. Its purpose was the creation of a chemically enhanced supersoldier. The history of Valhalla is the history of the Inner Circle's failure, where a government-sanctioned experiment was deemed unstable and abandoned, only to be resurrected by corporate avarice. This is the tragedy of the expendable soldier, proving that the state is a parent that strangles its children the moment they become inconvenient. The lore of Project Valhalla, 1991, provides the historical foundation for this chapter's reveal. Originally funded by the U.S. military during the Gulf War era, the goal was to improve the stamina and morale of infantry through synthetic neurochemistry. The lore suggests that the formula was flawed. Its purpose was the suppression of the fear response. Instead of creating tougher soldiers, the project produced psychotic subjects who suffered from vivid nightmares and uncontrollable rage. This reveals the calculative purpose of the project's termination. The Inner Circle didn't shut it down because it was evil. They shut it down because it was unreliable. This was the era of the secret syringe. This shows that the history of Valkyr is a history of the ghost, which was exorcised from the Pentagon only to haunt the streets. The physical environment of the Valhalla research facility provides insight into the industrial despair of the fall. This is a tomb of ambition hidden beneath a deserted steel mill, representing the cold reality of the military-industrial complex. The lore of the frozen laboratory explains that its purpose was the isolation of the moral atrocity. As Max breaches the security doors, he finds the cages where human guinea pigs were monitored until they succumbed to the green plague. This reveals the nihilistic purpose of the discovery. Max's personal tragedy was engineered in a concrete bunker a decade before his wife ever screamed. This was the era of the observation glass. This shows that the history of the facility is a history of the specimen, where the human being is reduced to a data point. The relationship between the inner circle and the shadow government represents the architectural corruption within the fall. Led by figures like Alfred Woden, this secret society controlled the city through influence and historical secrets. The lore suggests that the circle is a sovereign entity. Its purpose was the preservation of the American status quo at any cost. By funding the research that became Valkyr, they created the problem that they now hired Max to solve. This reveals the manipulative purpose of Woden's assistance. He used the Slayer to burn the evidence of the Circle's involvement, so they could maintain their seat at the table. This was the era of the hidden compass. The history of the Circle is the history of the puppet master, who cuts the strings when the play is over. Furthermore, the lore of Nicole Horn and the corporate resurrection represents the modernized malice within the fall. Horn, a former official in the Valhalla project, stole the formula and rebranded it as a street drug through Aesir Corporation. The lore suggests that the CEO is the true Valkyrie. Its purpose was the privatization of the military failure. By converting a failed weapon into a lucrative narcotic, Horn found a way to profit from the destruction of the city's soul. This reveals the evolutionary purpose of the conspiracy. Evil doesn't die, it just changes tax brackets. This was the era of the high-rise nightmare. This shows that the history of Horn is a history of the vampire, which feeds on the corpses of the past. The relationship between Michelle Payne's discovery and the targeted assassination represents the tragic intersection of the fall. It is revealed that Max's wife, while working at the district attorney's office, accidentally found the Valhalla files that linked Aesir to the military. The lore suggests that curiosity is a death sentence. Its purpose was the silencing of the institutional witness. The edicts sent to Max's house were not random. They were sent by Horn to erase the file and the woman who read it. This reveals the ironic purpose of Max's quest. He was searching for a motive that was tucked in his own home all along. This was the era of the leaked truth. The history of the files is the history of the evidence, which costs the family their lives. The lore of the computer mainframes and the digital sin represents the information warfare within the fall. Within the Valhalla bunker, Max downloads the logs that detail the agony of the subjects. The lore suggests that the machine remembers what the heart forgets. Its purpose was the cold documentation of the inhumanity. These files provide the hard iron-proof Max needs to destroy Aesir legally, though he knows the only verdict that matters is ballistic. This reveals the indelible purpose of the digital record. The corporation kept the receipts of their sins. This was the era of the flashing cursor. This shows that the history of the data is a history of the ghost script, which tells the Slayer who to kill next. The act concludes with the silent observation of Max Payne as he watches the Valhalla facility ignite after he triggers the self-destruct, realizing that the monsters he fought were born in a test tube. The purpose of the Cold War Echoes lore was to be the universal exposure of the manufactured tragedy. It shows that fate is scripted in a boardroom. Max realizes that he is a product of the same system that killed his child. The rise of the corporate infiltration is the final movement of the Valhalla lore, proving that in the world of Max Payne, history is not a memory, it is a weapon that is locked and loaded by the state. The legacy of Project Valhalla in this chapter is the horror of the weaponized trauma. We realize that war was a business and science was a noose that the inner circle placed around the neck of the future. The purpose of the workshop of the bunker was to engineer the end, and the fall was the discovery of the origin. As Max reloads his rifle in the shadow of the flaming mill and looks at the snow turning black, hearing the rumble of the explosions deep below, they understand that the history of Valhalla is the history of the void, a void that consumes the man and leaves the slayer to finish the work. The 6th chapter in our 10-part chronicle of Max Payne 1 moves from the scientific purgatory of the bunkers into the industrial inferno of the cold steel foundry. This is the narrative forging of the vengeance, where the physical architecture of the city's manufacturing past, towering blast furnaces, conveyor belts, and molten iron, becomes a lethal playground. Within the hissing steam and clanging metal, Max witnesses the transition of the war from a detective's investigation to a paramilitary assault. The lore of this era is the lore of the industrialized vendetta. Its purpose was the acquisition of the heavy ordnance required to breach the Aesir stronghold. The history of the foundry is the history of the Russian handover, where Vladimir Lem equipped the slayer with the tools of a professional soldier. This is the tragedy of the scorched earth, proving that fire is the only language that can melt the arrogance of the guilty. The lore of the Russian alliance, Vladimir Lem, provides the strategic foundation for this chapter's escalation. Unlike the addicted and unstable Punchinello family, Vladimir Lem represented the cool and calculated new world of international arms dealing. The lore suggests that the Russian is a pragmatist. Its purpose was the tactical removal of the Italian competition. By providing Max with high explosives and assault rifles, Vlad used Max as a human cruise missile to clear the board for his own expansion. This reveals the mercenary purpose of the alliance. Max was not a friend, he was a free contractor who didn't care if he died as long as he killed. This was the era of the Kalashnikov. This shows that the history of Vlad is a history of the investment, where the blood of the detective saves the business of the mob. The physical environment of the cold steel foundry provides insight into the mechanical despair of the fall. This is a machine for death operating in a state of decay, representing the obsolescence of the American blue-collar dream. The lore of the molten maze explains that its purpose was the testing of the hero's physical limits. Between the moving cranes and sniper nests, Max forced himself to become as hard and cold as the iron being poured around him. This reveals the metaphorical purpose of the foundry conflict. To kill the corporate gods, Max needed to be recast in lead. This was the era of the burning spark. This shows that the history of the foundry is a history of the forge, which turns the grieving father into an instrument of war. The relationship between the Valkyr security and the paramilitary evolution represents the hardening of the enemy within the fall. At the foundry, the thugs in leather jackets were replaced by Aesir security in Kevlar and tactical gear. The lore suggests that the enemy is learning. Its purpose was the escalation of the lethality to match the slayer's prowess. This reveals the Darwinian purpose of the war. The corporation stopped hiding behind criminals and started using its own army. This was the era of the professional kill zone. The history of the security is the history of the mask, which hides the face of the executive with the visor of the soldier. Furthermore, the lore of the explosive cache and the sabotage logic represents the destructive necessity of the fall. Within the heart of the foundry, Max sought the weaponry stored by the Punchinello family to defend against Aesir. The lore suggests that the armory is a target. Its purpose was the preparation for the vertical infiltration of the Aesir building. By rigging the foundry to blow, Max ensured that the Mafia's last resource was erased from the earth. This reveals the nihilistic purpose of the Slayer's path. He is not saving the city's economy. He is burning the foundations to get to the attic. This was the era of the countdown. This shows that the history of the cache is a history of the detonation. which turns the tool into a tomb. The relationship between the snowbound exterior and the isolated war zone represents the environmental silence within the fall. Outside the foundry, the blizzard reached its apex, creating a world where only Max and his enemies existed. The lore suggests that the storm is a boundary. Its purpose was the suspension of the social reality. In the whiteout of the steel yard, the police and the citizens vanished, leaving a primal coliseum where only the strongest could stay warm. This reveals the atmospheric purpose of the snow. It cleanses the ugliness of the metal with the purity of the cold. This was the era of the frozen shell casing. The history of the exterior is the history of the void, which separates the slayer from the sun. The lore of the crane operation and the mechanical puppetry represents the dehumanized combat within the fall. Max used the foundry's industrial systems to manipulate the battlefield, dropping heavy loads on enemies and creating bridges across pitfalls. The lore suggests that the machine is an extension of the body. Its purpose was the demonstration of the hero's ingenuity against overwhelming odds. This reveals the functional purpose of the environment. Everything in the foundry is a weapon if you are angry enough to swing it. This was the era of the lever and the gear. This shows that the history of the crane is a history of the leverage, where the small man topples the large system. The act concludes with the gigantic explosion of the cold steel foundry, as Max drives a truck through the flames, escaping with a crate of grenades and ammunition. The purpose of the steel and snow lore was to be the universal exposure of the war's industrial scale. It shows that grief has Massachusetts. Max realizes that he has become the weapon he sought. The rise of the ascent to Aesir is the final movement of the foundry lore, proving that in the world of Max Payne, justice is not a verdict, it is a chemical reaction that consumes the steel and leaves only the heat. The legacy of the foundry in this chapter is the horror of the industrialized vendetta. We realize that production was a cover and metal was a flesh that Vladimir Lem gifted to the Slayer to rip open the future. The purpose of the workshop of the forge was to arm the damned, and the fall was the destruction of the armory. As Max reloads his weapon in the glow of the dying fires and stares at the skyline of New York, hearing the rumble of the foundry collapsing behind him, they understand that the history of the steel is the history of the edge, an edge that cuts the guilty and reminds the slayer that the world only changes when the old iron is melted down. The 7th chapter in our 10-part chronicle of Max Payne 1 exposes the political web that hangs above the city like a piano wire. This is the narrative architectural betrayal, where the physical architecture of power, the neoclassical columns of the Asgard building and the hushed, mahogany-lined meeting rooms of the elite, reveals the shadow government pulling the strings. Within the classified archives and the hidden microphones, Max witnesses the institutional complicity of the inner circle. The lore of this era is the lore of the sovereign conspiracy. Its purpose was the containment of the Valkyr scandal through selective exposure. The history of the Gambit is the history of the hand that feeds the slayer, where Alfred Woden recruited Max to prune the rotten branches of a secret society that had grown too visible. This is the tragedy of the patriotic lie, proving that justice is a currency spent by old men in dark rooms to purchase their own anonymity. The lore of the inner circle, the Illuminati of the Noir, provides the sociological foundation for this chapter's complexity. Comprised of senators, judges, and corporate titans, this group managed the Valkyr project as a social engineering experiment before it escaped their control. The lore suggests that the circle is a self-correcting organism. Its purpose was the preservation of national stability through moral compromise. When Nicole Horn went rogue with the Aesir Corporation, the circle needed a blunt instrument to liquidate her without implicating themselves. This reveals the manipulative purpose of their alliance with Max. He was not their hero, he was their janitor, hired to bleed so the Senate could stay clean. This was the era of the secret handshake. This shows that the history of Woden is a history of the double game, where the truth is leaked only to bury a larger sin. The physical environment of the Asgard building provides insight into the stately despair of the fall. This is a fortress of tradition hidden in plain sight, representing the distance between the law and the lawmakers. The lore of the Hollow Pillar explains that its purpose was the demonstration of the hero's irrelevance to the system. As Max navigates the library, he discovers that his entire life, the death of his family, and his undercover years, was monitored as a footnote in a Senate subcommittee report. This reveals the crushing purpose of the Gambit. Max's suffering was bureaucratic data. This was the era of the dusty file. This shows that the history of the Asgard building is a history of the vault, which locks the victim inside the procedure. The relationship between BB and the final DEA betrayal represents the personal necrosis within the fall. Max arranged to meet his colleague BB at a chilly choir pier to exchange evidence, only to confirm that BB was the mole who murdered Alex Balder. The lore suggests that the partner is a price tag. Its purpose was the final severing of Max's professional ties. By executing BB in the snowy parking lot, Max completed his transformation from detective to vigilante, leaving the last remnant of his old career in a pool of frozen blood. This reveals the cynical purpose of the peer conflict. In the world of Max Payne, friendship is a bullet that has your name on it since the Academy. This was the era of the Pier 69. The history of BB is the history of the traitor who sells the soul for a corner office. Furthermore, the lore of the blackmail tape and the leverage logic represents the political armor within the fall. Alfred Woden provided Max with a videotape documenting the inner circle's illegal activities to ensure that the police would drop the charges against Max if he succeeded. The lore suggests that freedom is a trade. Its purpose was the insurance policy for the Slayer's survival. This reveals the transactional purpose of the Circle's mercy. Max was allowed to live, not because he was innocent, but because he held the evidence that could topple the government. This was the era of the VHS truth. This shows that the history of the tape is a history of the ransom, which turns the hero into a blackmailer to save his life. The relationship between the high-tech surveillance and the omnipresent eye represents the digital oppression within the fall. Throughout the Inner Circle chapters, Max realizes he is being watched by cameras and satellites linked to Acer and the Senate. The lore suggests that privacy is dead. Its purpose was the manifestation of the conspiracy's reach. This reveals the paranoid purpose of the narrative shift. The enemy is no longer hiding in a slum. They are broadcasting from the sky. This was the era of the green-tinted monitor. This shows that the history of the surveillance is a history of the panopticon, which turns the city into a cage of glass. The lore of the secret elevator and the vertical descent represents the subterranean reality within the fall. To meet the leaders, Max descended through hidden panels into the guts of the city. The lore suggests that power is sunk deep. Its purpose was the symbolism of the moral bottom. The lower Max went, the more corruption he found, proving that the foundation of New York is built on the sins of the elite. This reveals the excavatory purpose of the Gambit. Max had to go underground to find the light. This was the era of the hidden key. This shows that the history of the elevator is a history of the descent, which leads the Slayer to the heart of the rot. The act concludes with the final handshake between Max Payne and Alfred Woden, as Woden points the weapon toward the Acer building. The purpose of the Inner Circle lore was to be the universal exposure of the hero's role as a pawn. It shows that vengeance is orchestrated. Max realizes that his rage was directed by the very people he should be arresting. The rise of the storming of Acer is the final movement of the Gambit lore, proving that in the world of Max Payne, justice is not a decision made by a jury, it is a strategic necessity executed by a man who is too broken to refuse. The legacy of Alfred Woden in this chapter is the horror of the sovereign conspiracy. We realize that safety was a statistical lie and law was a script that the inner circle edited to suit their survival. The purpose of the workshop of the Senate was to curate the chaos, and the fall was the loss of the individual agency. As Max reloads his weapon in the marble lobby and stares at the security monitors, hearing the tick of the clock in the silent room, they understand that the history of the circle is the history of the web, a web that entraps the slayer and ensures that the world only heals when the spiders decide to eat their own. The 8th chapter in our 10-part chronicle of Max Payne 1 marks the vertical infiltration of the Aesir Corporation headquarters. This is the narrative storming of the heaven, where the physical architecture of the city's skyline, a monolith of steel and glass, becomes a modern bastion of corporate tyranny. Within the automated laser grids and high-speed elevators, Max witnesses the transition of power from the street-level grime to the sanitized brutality of the high-rise elite. The lore of this era is the lore of the sterile oppression. Its purpose was the absolute insulation of the architect from the consequences of her design. The history of the Aesir ascent is the history of the decapitation of the Goliath, where a disposable detective climbed the corporate ladder with a gun in hand. This is the tragedy of the glass ceiling, proving that height is the final defense of the guilty, who believe they are untouchable by the gravity of their sins. The lore of the Aesir private army, the Black Suits, provides the tactical foundation for this chapter's intensity. These were not mafia thugs or street junkies, but elite mercenaries equipped with submachine guns and strategic intelligence. The lore suggests that the corporation is a nation-state. Its purpose was the military enforcement of the profit margin. By hiring former special forces, Nicole Horn ensured that any investigation would die in the lobby. This reveals the pragmatic purpose of the security escalation. The executive viewed the law as a trespasser to be neutralized with clinical precision. This was the era of the tactical visor. This shows that the history of Aesir security is a history of the barrier, which separates the victim from the truth. The physical environment of the Aesir lobby and the executive levels provides insight into the aesthetic of the arrogance of the fall. This is a temple of transparency, where the glass reflects the city but hides the atrocity. The lore of the transparent labyrinth explains that its purpose was the manifestation of the corporate ego. As Max shatters the display cases and server rooms, he is breaking the veneer of legitimacy that Aesir built to mask the Valkyr labs. This reveals the iconoclastic purpose of the ascent. To find the devil, Max had to climb the stairway to paradise. This was the era of the falling shards. This shows that the history of the building is a history of the mirage, which crumbles under the weight of the truth. The relationship between the automated defense systems and the dehumanized defense represents the technological shield within the fall. Throughout the climb, Max encountered computer-operated turrets and motion-sensing mines, proving that the corporation distrusted human loyalty as much as it feared Max's vengeance. The lore suggests that the machine is the purest guardian. Its purpose was the removal of the human factor from the execution. This reveals the alienated purpose of the defensive logic. Nicole Horn didn't want to look at the man who was coming for her. She wanted him deleted by a program. This was the era of the laser tripwire. This shows that the history of the automation is a history of the denial, which treats the slayer like a glitch. Furthermore, the lore of the mainframe sabotage and the digital collapse represents the informational erasure of the fall. Within the deep servers of the building, Max uploaded the inner circle's evidence to ensure the world saw the rot before the corporation could delete the record. The lore suggests that the data is the real body. Its purpose was the permanent documentation of the biological crimes. By destroying the central computer, Max crippled the financial infrastructure of Aesir, ensuring that even if he died, the company would bleed to death in the markets. This reveals the systemic purpose of the sabotage. Max was ending the organization, not just the officer. This was the era of the blue screen of death. The relationship between the high-speed elevator and the psychological weight represents the linear momentum within the fall. As the floor numbers increment toward the penthouse, the air grew thinner and the enemies grew harder. The lore suggests that the ascent is a judgment. Its purpose was the accumulation of the final rage. With every floor Max cleared, he was closing the gap between the detective and the executioner. This reveals the metaphorical purpose of the verticality. Max was rising above the law to reach the justice that the streets couldn't provide. This was the era of the ding of the arrival. The history of the elevator is the history of the countdown, which leads the slayer to the summit. The lore of the Mona Sack's reappearance and the mortal conflict represents the fatal hesitation within the fall. Inside the inner security elevator, Max encountered Mona one last time, only for her to refuse her contract to kill him, resulting in her apparent death at the hands of the black suits. The lore suggests that the assassin is redeemable. Its purpose was the verification of the hero's humanity. By refusing to shoot Max, Mona proved that grief and empathy are stronger than corporate dividends. This reveals the emotional purpose of the conflict. Even in the cold heart of Acer, the human bond could survive the steel. This was the era of the silent sacrifice. This shows that the history of Mona is a history of the choice, which saves the slayer from his own shadow. The act concludes with the silent arrival of Max Payne at the top floor, as the doors open to reveal the rain-slashed glass of the Nicole Horn penthouse. The purpose of the Fortress of Glass lore was to be the universal exposure of the height of the conspiracy. It shows that evil lives in the penthouse. Max realizes that he has entered the final chapter. The rise of the rooftop reckoning is the final movement of the Acer lore, proving that in the world of Max Payne, success is not a reward, it is a gallows that is built with stolen wealth and polished with innocent blood. The legacy of the Acer building in this chapter is the horror of the sterile oppression. We realize that progress was a sanitized slaughter and architecture was a cage that Nicole Horn used to view the misery she manufactured. The purpose of the workshop of the sky was to isolate the guilty, and the fall was the descent of the ceiling. As Max steps onto the thick carpet of the final office and looks at the skyline of New York, shuddering under the blizzard, hearing the hum of the building failing around him, they understand that the history of Acer is the history of the fall, a fall that begins at the top and ends in the pavement. The 9th chapter in our 10-part chronicle of Max Payne 1 reaches its altitude of absolute justice, atop the Acer building. This is the narrative breaking of the statue, where the physical architecture of the corporate skyline, the antenna towers, heliports, and steel cables, becomes the gallows of the elite. Within the blizzard-whipped rooftops and the screaming wind, Max witnesses the final deconstruction of the Acer Corporation's matriarch. The lore of this era is the lore of the ballistic resolution. Its purpose was the shattering of the corporate immunity through environmental sabotage. The history of the summit is the history of the fall of the Valkyr, where Nicole Horn attempted to ascend into the safety of the sky, only to be pulled back to the earth by the gravity of Max's vengeance. This is the tragedy of the glass throne, proving that height is a liability when the foundation is eaten by truth. The lore of the Nicole Horn supremacy provides the psychological foundation for this chapter's climax. As the architect of Project Valhalla and the matriarch of the plague, Horn represented the cold intelligence that viewed humanity as a chemical variable. The lore suggests that the CEO is the purest villain. Its purpose was the demonstration of the total absence of remorse. Even as her empire burned, Horn remained clinical, attempting to exit the chaos via her private transport, while ordering her men to die for her timetable. This reveals the psychopathic purpose of the corporate leadership, the executive values the departure over the survival of the species. This was the era of the final board meeting. This shows that the history of Horn is a history of the ice, which never melts, even in the heat of the muzzle flash. The physical environment of the rooftop helipad provides insight into the kinetic despair of the fall. This is a stage of iron, suspended in the middle of a hurricane, symbolizing the hero's final separation from the civilized world. The lore of the unstable altar explains that its purpose was the final test of the Slayer's accuracy. Between the swaying antenna and the roaring blades of the escape helicopter, Max realized that bullets couldn't reach the guilty inside the armor. This reveals the poetic purpose of the environmental sabotage. To kill the Valkyrie, Max had to shatter the sky by targeting the guy wires of the radio tower. This was the era of the falling steel. This shows that the history of the rooftop is a history of the leverage, where the small projectile topples the colossal structure. The relationship between the Acer escape helicopter and the hubris of flight represents the technological cowardice within the fall. The Valkyr transport was meant to be the vehicle of the Great Escape, carrying Horn away to an unreachable sanctuary. The lore suggests that the machine is a false promise. Its purpose was the illustration of the failed ascension. By severing the tower so that it crushed the aircraft, Max proved that money cannot buy an exit from the narrative of vengeance. This reveals the ironic purpose of the helicopter's destruction. The Valkyrie was ground into the glass by the very tower that broadcasted her power. This was the era of the twisted rotor. The history of the escape is the history of the impact, which buries the guilty in their own technology. Furthermore, the lore of the final guard and the suicidal loyalty represents the automatic protection of the fall. Horn's personal bodyguards fought to the last breath, proving that the corporation purchased the soul of its soldiers entirely. The lore suggests that the guard is a human shield. Its purpose was the buying of seconds for the matriarch's flight. This reveals the disposable purpose of the mercenary ethics. In the world of Max Payne, men die to protect a profit they will never share. This was the era of the last magazine. This shows that the history of the guard is a history of the waste, which piles the bodies high to reach the clouds. The relationship between the radio tower and the global communication represents the deafening of the message within the fall. The tower was the voice of Acer, spreading the corporate influence across the state. The lore suggests that the signal is a lie. Its purpose was the maintenance of the cultural illusion. By bringing the tower down, Max stopped the broadcasting of the conspiracy, symbolically silencing the corporate ghost that inhabited the airwaves. This reveals the acoustic purpose of the climax. The Slayer didn't just kill a woman, he disconnected the system. This was the era of the static. The history of the tower is the history of the silence, which allows the city to hear the truth. The lore of the final confrontation and the absence of dialogue represents the purest hostility within the fall. Unlike other Noir endings, there was no long speech from the villain that changed the hero's mind. The lore suggests that the sin is beyond words. Its purpose was the final stripping of the narrative to the essential act of violence. Horn screamed in fear, and Max answered with lead, proving that philosophy ends where judgment begins. This reveals the ballistic purpose of the resolution. In the end, the only currency that cleared the debt was the impact of the falling statue. This was the era of the last bullet. The act concludes with the gigantic crash of the Acer antenna through the helipad, as the explosion lights up the frozen night. The purpose of the summit lore was to be the universal exposure of the end of the corporate god. It shows that armor fails. Max realizes that he has finished the work. The rise of the police arrival is the final movement of the summit lore, proving that in the world of Max Payne, vengeance is not a healing, it is a demolition that leaves the Slayer standing on the rubble of his own life. The legacy of Nicole Horn in this chapter is the horror of the absolute resolution. We realize that justice was a crushing weight and victory was a falling tower that Max triggered to exorcise the nightmare. The purpose of the workshop of the sky was to execute the architect, and the fall was the end of the Valkyr. As Max reloads his weapon for the last time in the glare of the flaming wreckage and looks at the helicopters of the NYPD surrounding the roof, hearing the wail of the wind dying out in the heat, they understand that the history of the summit is the history of the gravity, a gravity that claims the guilty and leaves the slayer to wait for the end. The 10th and final chapter in our chronicle of Max Payne 1, 2001, reaches the postscript of the storm on the rooftop of the Asser building. This is the narrative final silence, where the physical architecture of the crime scene, the shattered glass, the smoking wreckage, and the red and blue lights of the NYPD helicopters becomes the courtroom of the night. Within the cold reality of the arrest and the vanishment of the adrenaline, Max witnesses the institutional resolution of his crusade. The lore of this era is the lore of the managed justice. Its purpose was the transition from the lawless vigilante to the legal asset. The history of the awakening is the history of the Woden handshake, where the slayer was protected from the executioner's chair by the very shadows he helped prune. This is the tragedy of the living ghost, proving that freedom is not a right, but a pardon signed in the ink of selective amnesia. The lore of the Alfred Woden Immunity Agreement provides the political foundation for this chapter's resolution. Despite the massacre Max conducted across New York, he was led away in handcuffs with a smile on his face. The lore suggests that the deal was absolute. Its purpose was the strategic preservation of the inner circle's cleaner. By providing the Senate with the evidence to destroy Nicole Horn, Max earned a clean slate brokered by Alfred Woden. This reveals the manipulative purpose of the end. The government couldn't afford to prosecute the man who held their secrets. This was the era of the legal ghost. This shows that the history of Max Payne is a history of the bargain, where the law bends to accommodate the useful monster. The physical environment of the NYPD extraction provides insight into the atmospheric relief of the fall. As the SWAT teams breached the roof, the white noise of the blizzard was replaced by the order of radio chatter. The lore of the surrender explains that its purpose was the formal re-entry into the social contract. After 3 days of hell, the handcuffs felt like a relief because they represented a world with rules. This reveals the psychological purpose of the arrest. Max wanted to be caught so he could stop killing. This was the era of the cuffed hands. This shows that the history of the rooftop is a history of the boundary, which separates the chaos of the night from the order of the morning. The relationship between Jim Bravura and the institutional witness represents the moral observation within the fall. Detective Jim Bravura, the man who hunted Max relentlessly, was the first to reach him on the roof. The lore suggests that the law is blind but persistent. Its purpose was the validation of Max's sanity. By witnessing the truth of the Asser atrocity, Bravura ceased to be an enemy and became the legal anchor for Max's account. This reveals the validation purpose of the final encounter. Even the purest cop had to admit that the criminal was right. This was the era of the shared cigarette. The history of Bravura is the history of the integrity, which recognizes the necessity of the shadow. Furthermore, the lore of the missing body of Mona Sachs represents the lingering mystery within the fall. When the police searched the elevator where Mona was shot, her body was gone. The lore suggests that the Noir never really ends. Its purpose was the seeding of the future conflict. By removing the evidence of her death, the narrative ensured that Max's isolation would eventually be interrupted by the past. This reveals the cyclical purpose of the Mona paradox. In the world of Max Payne, love is a ghost that refuses to stay buried. This was the era of the empty bloodstain. This shows that the history of Mona is a history of the echo, which haunts the slayer long after the guns are silent. The relationship between the ending smile and the bittersweet catharsis represents the internal peace of the fall. In the final comic panel, Max is shown smiling as he is escorted away. The lore suggests that the debt is paid. Its purpose was the completion of the personal vendetta. Max didn't smile because he was free. He smiled because Michel and his child were avenged, and the Valkyr plague was halted. This reveals the somatic purpose of the catharsis. The physical pain remained, but the spiritual weight lifted. This was the era of the shivering grin. The history of the smile is the history of the grave, which is finally filled with justice. The lore of the post-game summary and the statistical carnage represents the numerical reality within the fall. The lore reveals that Max killed hundreds of people in a single night, changing the crime statistics of New York forever. The lore suggests that the Slayer is a natural disaster. Its purpose was the total liquidation of the underworld infrastructure. From the subway to the penthouse, Max left a void that would take decades to fill. This reveals the structural purpose of the massacre. Max didn't just kill villains, he uninstalled the mafia from the operating system of the city. This was the era of the empty social clubs. The act concludes with the fading of the main theme as the screen turns black, leaving the user with the sound of the siren. The purpose of the awakening and the handcuffs lore was to be the universal exposure of the necessity of the scapegoat. It shows that order requires sacrifice. Max realizes that he is a hero in a world that cannot admit it. The rise of the legend is the final movement of the Max Payne 1 lore, proving that in the world of the noir, victory is not a trophy, it is the ability to walk away from the graveyard with your soul, even if it is in pieces. The legacy of the Acer rooftop in this final chapter is the horror of the managed justice. We realize that truth was a weapon and law was a closing gate that Alfred Woden held open just long enough for the Slayer to pass through. The purpose of the workshop of the end was to archive the atrocity, and the fall was the restoration of the silence. As Max rides in the back of the police cruiser and watches the snow covering the city, hearing the rhythm of the tires on the wet asphalt, they understand that the history of Max Payne is the history of the bullet, a bullet that traveled through the heart of the night and finally found its target.